Hello, and welcome to this week's podcast, Apocalypse Now, Part 3, Pandemics and Pathogens. Apocalypse. It has many forms and orbits around many fears. We have attempted to take an honest look at some of these scary possibilities. First, we considered nuclear war and concluded that the danger is real, but also that the systems have worked so far. For 8 decades, in fact. Next, we took on global warming and other trending environmental causes and concluded that CO2 has both harmful and beneficial effects. And, on a subject over which there is no real consensus scientifically, there is every reason to be optimistic. We also learned how much play actually exists within models for any kind of predictions, environmental or otherwise. The predictions for the 2020 election would have been much different in the fall of 2019 than they were after COVID hit, because the models didn't contain the impact of COVID, and no one could have predicted COVID. Even one factor that is not considered can change everything. And there will always be many factors that we do not and cannot predict. The further out you try to make predictions, the more wildly off you will be because of that. Take the weather forecast. Predictions for the next day's weather are relatively accurate. Predictions for next week's weather are less so. And predictions for a month from now are usually way off. Any miscalculation, a storm falling apart sooner than expected, or moving faster than you calculated, etc., adds up and turns all distant predictions on their heads. So trying to predict something, anything, be it elections, wars, or the climate, decades or even centuries out, has wild inaccuracies baked right in from the start. Now, let's take a look at the scenario with the threat that is perhaps most active in the minds of the most people out there: pandemics. For us, COVID was an anomaly, but for most of history, epidemics were just a regular reality of life. The first recorded pandemic caused 1/3 to nearly half of Europe to die. The Black Death swept across the known world unchecked for years between 1347 and 1351. After spreading through the Middle East, India, and Mesopotamia, it reached the trading port of Kaffa. The ships that left that trading port carried goods, which attracted rats that had fleas, who carried the deadly disease. In October of 1347, 12 such ships arrived in Messina, Sicily, full of dead and dying sailors. By the time the harbor authorities realized what they were dealing with, it was too late. Rats and fleas had already jumped ship and were spreading the bubonic plague across Europe. At the tail end of that pandemic, there was a desire to find scapegoats. Not yet advanced enough scientifically to understand how this disease or any other really spread, humanity turned to its favorite scapegoat, the Jews. Pogroms were carried out all over Europe, and Jews were completely annihilated in some places, while other cities, like Marseille, became safe havens for them. Let's see. Scary worldwide pandemic, followed by a spike in anti-Semitism. Where have I heard that story before? Ah, yes. Apparently, history really does repeat itself. No one was safe from the Black Death. Even kings and queens died. No privilege could save you. The light that was the school of art and science in Florence was extinguished after too many of its rising stars were lost to the plague and died. The one good thing was the rise in wages that followed the death of so many laborers. Wars also dropped off, as men were needed to farm all the land that was going to seed and had no time for conquests. With increased wages for the surviving lower classes, real social change suddenly became truly possible. Ring Around the Roses, the popular children's rhyme, is actually about the bubonic plague in London in 1665, when a second wave of a more virulent strand of the same disease hit hard. Ring around the rosies refers to the painful rash that marked the infected. A pocket full of posies refers to the flower petals that doctors carried to try to overwhelm the smell of all the dead. Ashes, ashes refers to the funeral pyres that were used to burn the dead. We all fall down implies certain death, as the mortality rates for the infected were between 60 and 90% fatalities. Millions of people died in Britain and France and elsewhere in Europe during this second wave of the epidemic. Although these waves of bubonic plague were the first to really be recorded in detail, they were not the first time that the world had seen this plague. We now know that the plague of Justinian in 541 to 549 AD in Constantinople was also bubonic plague. 10,000 people were dying each day, and corpses were stacked indoors like produce and left littered on public streets and squares. Between 30 and 50 million people died in Egypt, the Mediterranean, Northern Europe, and the Arabian Peninsula, and the bubonic plague was not done with the world yet. Though it had never disappeared entirely, it resurged violently in 1855 in China. By 1894, it had spread from port cities to Hong Kong. Outbound ships brought it to Bombay, Calcutta, Cape Town, and San Francisco by the turn of the century. But it didn't stop there. Before its end, in 1959, 12 million people across the world would be dead. Half of those casualties were in India. But science finally caught up with this killer. The bacteria that caused this fatal disease was identified in 1894 in Hong Kong. Scientists observed that a litter of dead rats in the streets often preceded an outbreak. The fleas on the rats carrying the disease then moved to humans as their new hosts. Preventative measures and insecticides were used to proactively fight the disease by killing the rats and fleas that carried it. Hooray for the Orkin Man! Effective treatments were later discovered in the 1930s for the poor souls who still contracted the deadly disease. When antibiotics like streptomycin were invented in 1947, the world finally tamed the deadliest pandemic disease that mankind had ever known. Europe had also seen plagues of smallpox for centuries. 20 to 60% of those it infected died, but any survivors emerged immune. The New World, though, had never seen this disease and therefore had absolutely no immunity against it. The natives were wide open and vulnerable when Spanish ships carrying an infected slave from Africa arrived at Veracruz, Mexico in April of 1520. Outbreaks spread from the very first contact and continued with each wave of immigrants over the next several decades. The natives who survived the smallpox epidemic were hit by the influenza that followed, and then by the measles that followed that. 90% of the native population died, somewhere between 25 and 56 million native people. The Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919 infected 500 million people globally, a third of the world's population at the time, and killed between 25 and 50 million people, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in history. And that was only 100 years ago, right after World War I. In the United States alone, 22 million people were infected, and it killed 675,000 of them. When the disease arrived in a remote village in Alaska, it only took 5 days to kill 90% of its citizens. In parts of India, the devastation was so complete that survivors couldn't even keep up with disposing of the bodies, and they were left for scavengers to dispose of. Troop ships bringing the heroes of World War I home seemed to be how it all started. In 6 months, Southeast Asia lost as many as 13.5 million people. Freetown in Sierra Leone lost 4% of its population in just the first 3 weeks. Persia lost as much as 22% of its population. Eventually, herd immunity brought the epidemic to an end. The thing that made this plague so devastating is that the young were vulnerable, not just the old and infirm. Half of the casualties were in their 20s and 30s. 8 to 10% of our young people were lost to this epidemic, and that's after the heavy losses of the first ever World War, which was the first war that saw the use of chemical warfare. The wealthy fared better during this epidemic, as long as they were able to remain safely outside of populated areas while the deadly flu spread. But the loss of all the young people affected everyone. Some regions experienced famines, and almost all parts of the Western world experienced Great Depressions following World War I and the deadly pandemic. The struggles born from these depressions, for which the Jews were again blamed, led to revolutions, the end of several old empires, and ultimately to World War II and the Holocaust. And there were many, many other deadly epidemics throughout history, both here and in other parts of the world. COVID is not even the only one in recent history. The AIDS epidemic is still a part of our collective memory. Some theorize that HIV crossed from chimpanzees to humans via blood contact in the 1920s in the Congo. They believe that it continued to spread undetected until 1981, when the combination of this undetected virus crossed paths with a virulent strand of pneumonia and a rare cancer called Kaposi sarcoma in gay men in the United States. By the end of the year, there were 270 reported cases, 121 of which were already dead. But it is believed that by this time, HIV was already on 5 continents, infecting between 100,000 and 300,000 people. By the time a global program was launched in 1987, between 5 and 10 million people were living with HIV worldwide. Today, around 38 million people still live with HIV, and 2/3 of those live in sub-Saharan Africa. UNAIDS estimated that 36.6 million people died from AIDS-related illness. Perhaps worst of all, it could be spread to the unborn. Education and awareness, along with improved treatments and breakthroughs in medical science and access to those treatments, have caused AIDS-related fatalities to decline by 47% since 2010. But HIV remains incurable despite these advances. Talents such as Rock Hudson, Anthony Perkins, Liberace, and the great Freddie Mercury were lost to this deadly epidemic. But others, like Elizabeth Taylor and Princess Diana, led the way in showing compassion to those with a disease which most people feared with extreme dread. Anthony Fauci really came to the forefront during this epidemic, long before he came to prominence during COVID. In December of 2019, several unusual pneumonia cases cropped up in Wuhan, China. At first, officials offered reassurances that the disease could not be spread from one human to another. This quickly proved false. By January, COVID-19 was emerging as a global health crisis. By March, it had spread to at least 114 countries. The world cascaded into lockdowns, crippling economies and psyches alike. A year and a half later, an estimated 5 million people were dead. Mostly the elderly and those compromised by poor health conditions and obesity. And with debates swirling about the origins of the disease, whether it was natural or man-made, and over the effectiveness of the vaccine, its emerging side effects, and overall effectiveness at stopping transmission from the vaccinated to others, as well as the general mismanagement and even abuses of power, we are still trying to resolve what will be the lasting effects of this pandemic. I represent science, Fauci declared, in the middle of this heated controversy. But how true was that? What do we know now that we can learn from for the next time? In the beginning, it was Democrats who dismissed the danger of the virus. Nancy Pelosi publicly urged people not to be afraid. Quote, "But we do want to say to people, come to Chinatown. Here we are." These dismissals were echoed by Anthony Fauci as well, the director of the nation's leading infectious disease organization. Quote, "Bottom line, we don't have to worry about this one, right?" asked Greg Kelly on January 21st of 2020. Quote, "This is not a major threat for the people in the United States, and this is not something that the citizens of the United States should be worried about," responded Dr. Fauci on air. Only 1 month later on ABC, he was saying, quote, "There should be universal wearing of masks. There should be the extent possible social distancing, avoiding crowds, outdoors always better than indoors, etc." This was the first time that most of us had heard the name Anthony Fauci. But he had been around for a long, long time by this point. Between 1983 and 2002, he was the 13th most cited scientist in the world across all disciplines among almost 3 million authors. That must mean he's good at what he does, right? Not so much. The many positions he has taken on a variety of issues have swung like a pendulum for decades. Quote, "In essence, AIDS is a difficult disease to catch." Quote, "You can't isolate yourself from the rest of the world for the whole flu season." Quote, "I would like to see a dramatic diminution of the personal interaction that we see. Whatever it takes to do that, that's what I'd like to see." And more are all quotes of things that have been said publicly by Anthony Fauci. So let's take a look at the track record of the man that the world trusted so much at a time of unprecedented panic. In 1990, Bruce Nussbaum began a study to look into the federal government's failure to effectively fight the AIDS epidemic. In this study, he concluded, quote, "The best scientists do not become administrators. The best scientists do not become coordinators of programs for other scientists in medical schools around the country. The best scientists stay in the labs. They don't push papers." His criticism applied to the entire government's health apparatus, but this criticism was also directed at one bureaucrat in particular, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Bruce Nussbaum referred to him as a, quote, "lackluster scientist." But one thing he has always been is a rising politician. Nussbaum declared Fauci's true gift was, quote, "empire building." In 1984, he first took over the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. AIDS was only about 3 years old at this point. Fauci himself said, quote, "My career and my identity has really been defined by HIV. But there is not a lot to be proud of in his record on AIDS. From the beginning, his fame seems to be the primary focus of his attention, more than his work as a researcher. Larry Kramer, co-founder of the Gay Men's Health Crisis, commented that in order to make an appointment with Dr. Fauci, one did not call his secretary or his personal assistant, but rather his press officers. He said that Dr. Fauci's book, quote, "talks and interviews like movie stars." During both epidemics, Dr. Fauci sought out the TV cameras more than his laboratory. At the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, 2 approaches were considered: vaccines or therapeutic treatments. With limited resources available, the government faced a choice. They could pursue drugs that would suppress the virus, turning it into a chronic disease rather than a terminal illness, or they could focus on creating a vaccine that would prevent you from contracting AIDS in the first place. As an immunologist, Fauci chose the latter approach. After decades using millions of dollars at his disposal, Fauci had still not provided a vaccine. Thankfully, AIDS has gone from a death sentence to a manageable illness through therapeutic treatments. This is not thanks to Dr. Fauci, but is in spite of him. In 1987, more than 1 million Americans had contracted AIDS when it was still a death sentence, and under Dr. Fauci, the government failed to produce even one treatment for them. Fauci barely survived his horrific failure by turning over control of the government's only AIDS drug trial program to a pharmaceutical company. Kary Mullis, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, publicly said on television, quote, "Guys like Fauci get up there and start talking. You know, he doesn't know anything real about anything. And I'd say that to his face. Nothing." During the first few years of his tenure, Dr. Fauci had spent $374 million on AIDS treatment research, with little, if anything, to show for it. Larry Kramer publicly berated him as a, quote, incompetent idiot who had, quote, established only a system of waste, chaos, and uselessness. It was the private sector that finally produced azithromycin, or AZT, which was approved by the FDA on March 19, 1987. It was heralded as a breakthrough and the light at the end of the tunnel. It was approved by the FDA faster than any other drug in U.S. history up until that point. It cost nearly $8,000 per patient per year, which would have been the equivalent of $17,000 before all this inflation hit us. Even so, this was literally the cost of someone's life, and AZT did seem to work at first. But patients soon began showing an increase in the level of the virus. Technically, they were showing higher levels of a new and more virulent strain of the virus that had mutated to resist the drug. And the drug itself was proving toxic. Despite these very troubling results and warnings that AZT should only be used as a last-ditch effort to save the life of an AIDS patient who was literally on the brink of death, Fauci continued to push for expanding the prescribing of this drug. By 1989, the government, following his lead, announced that the 1.4 million Americans infected with HIV, even those living without any symptoms, could benefit from taking the dangerous drug. Fauci promised that 2 years of research had shown that early use of the drug could keep AIDS at bay. But when Spin magazine looked into the government's work on AIDS, and Anthony Fauci in particular, they could find no trace of this wonderful study he referred to. When they approached the NIH to ask for a copy of that study, they were told that the study was not complete yet and was still being written. Quote, "It's terribly dishonest the way they portrayed those numbers," Dr. Sonnabend, someone Fauci himself described as, quote, "one of the true soldiers in the war against HIV, said as part of his vigorous criticism of the government's approach to AZT under Fauci. Despite a French study published at the end of 1988 citing the dangers of the drug and concluding that AZT was toxic for most people, had no lasting effects on HIV levels in their blood, and left patients with fewer T4 cells than they started with, it continued to be prescribed to patients with no symptoms. And some activists even promoted prescribing it to those who did not have HIV but were at risk, simply as a preventative measure. Jean Fedoko, the president of Health Education AIDS Liaison, said, "I am absolutely convinced that people enjoy a better quality of life and survive longer who do not take AZT. I think it's horrible the way people are bullied by their doctors to take this drug. We get people coming to us shaking and crying because their doctors said they'll die if they don't take AZT. That is an absolute lie. Prominent AIDS activist Michael Callan responded vehemently, quote, I wouldn't take AZT if you paid me. I've gotten the shit kicked out of me for saying this, but I think taking AZT is like aiming a thermonuclear warhead at a mosquito. The overwhelming majority of long-term survivors I've known have chosen not to take AZT. This truly was a case of fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and Anthony Fauci was the head fool. In May of 1983, in a published article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Fauci said, the possibility that routine close contact, as within a family household, can spread the disease. He speculated that, quote, if indeed the latter is true, then AIDS takes on an entirely new dimension. If we add to this possibility that non-sexual, non-bloodborne transmission is possible, the scope of the syndrome may be enormous. He reiterated the need to be cautious since these findings were unsupported by any evidence, while still voicing his theories publicly and not privately, asserting that his discovery, quote, should at least alert us to the possibility that we are truly dealing with AIDS in children via routine interactions. He continued to push this narrative in the media, quote, as we're seeing virtually as the months go by, other groups that can be involved, and seeing it in children is really quite disturbing. Question: when you say other close contact, give me some examples. Response: well, for example, if the close contact of a child is a household contact, perhaps there will be a certain number of cases of individuals who are just living within close contact with someone with AIDS or with risk of AIDS, who does not necessarily have to have intimate sexual contact or share a needle, but just the ordinary close contact that one sees, end quote. Such irresponsible public speculating increased the panic surrounding the AIDS epidemic and led to the extreme ostracization of those suffering from the disease. The next year, he admitted in the Annals of Internal Medicine, quote, there is no evidence that the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome can be transmitted by routine household or social contact. So where had he even gotten the idea that probably led to a lot of people dying alone and uncomforted in the first place? He has declined to ever say, because it appears there was never any evidence for this opinion that he unforgivably gave voice to publicly. In fact, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a letter from two physicians after Fauci made his first claim that said, quote, it is too early to suggest that AIDS is acquired by household contact without substantial evidence to support such a claim. It was too early for responsible scientists to exacerbate the panic with unsubstantiated claims, but it was not too early for Dr. Fauci, who made the sensationalist but implausible claim that, quote, our experience suggests that children living in high-risk households are susceptible to AIDS, and that sexual contact, drug abuse, or exposure to blood products is not necessary for disease transmission. This long-standing history on Dr. Fauci's part of rushing to the press and making sensationalist, though unsubstantiated claims, flip-flopping, taking both sides of the issue, then denying his past statements while never apologizing for getting it wrong, became a lifelong habit that defined his public career. As they would do later with COVID, the press, likewise, rushed to print any words that dripped from Fauci's lips without confirming their validity. Quote, household contact may transmit AIDS, UPI published in 1983. That same year, the Associated Press published, quote, Does AIDS spread by routine contact? The New York Times published on May 5th, 1983, quote, "Family contacts studied in transmitting AIDS. A study of 8 families in Newark, New Jersey shows that some children may have contracted a deadly disease of the immune system through routine close contact with their families," a researcher says. Even as other public health authorities, including President Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler, stated that there is no evidence that the general population is threatened by AIDS, few believed her. Even conservative leader Pat Buchanan turned on Reagan's health secretary, quoting Fauci's editorial as evidence, which was entered into the congressional record. The so-called expert, for all of his confidence, was totally, and under the circumstances, unforgivably wrong. It took only 2 months for Fauci to start walking back his initial claims. Quote, "It is absolutely preposterous to suggest that AIDS can be contracted through normal social contact, like being in the same room with someone or sitting on a bus with them," he told the Baltimore Sun. "The poor gays have received a very raw deal on this." Indeed, they had, and it was a raw deal of Fauci's making. But Fauci continued to claim that children could spread the virus through normal household interactions. One of the most disturbing aspects of the government's efforts to fight AIDS involved children, specifically foster children, who were subjected to drug trials by the NIH and Dr. Fauci's NIAID. Investigations that occurred decades later uncovered that these children, these foster children, were often not provided with a personal health advocate during these drug trials. The vulnerable children suffered horrible side effects from these experiments, including rashes, vomiting, and sharp drops in blood cells capable of fighting off infections. In one study, at least 10 children died, 4 of which died from blood poisoning. Authorities at the time did not attribute the deaths to the drug that was being tested on them, but disturbingly, they offered no other explanation. To this day, researchers have still not explained why the overall mortality rate among children receiving this drug in this trial was so much higher. Even more concerning to the future than Fauci's questionable priorities, irresponsible press statements, and his experimentation on wards of the state, is how Fauci has been able to survive all these scandals virtually unscathed. His is a record of nothing but failures, and yet he remains in power, and even more shockingly, he remains trusted. Quote, "Fauci is all about Fauci. He loves being the headline. It's his ego," says Jonathan Fishbein, a medical safety expert and NIH whistleblower, who, as journalist Celia Farber, who had covered Dr. Fauci and the NIAID since the 1980s, put it, Fishbein's big problem is that he thought his job was legit when he exposed the corruption and misconduct that was happening on Fauci's watch. He said, quote, "I'm concerned about a lack of compliance on the part of many investigators, and I'm concerned about the lack of oversight by the federal government, particularly the NIH, and making sure that rules are followed." Edmund Tremont, the chief of the division, ordered a colleague to figure out a way to bust Fishbein without it reflecting badly on the man at the top. Quote, "Tony will not want anything to come back on us, so we are going to have ironclad documentation. No sense of harassment or unfairness, and like other personnel actions, this is going to take some work." But Fishbein's firing did not go over well with the public, and their representatives soon began calling for an investigation. The NIH insisted that Fishbein had been fired for poor job performance, but there were documents showing that the institute itself had recommended that he receive a cash bonus for his performance only weeks before. So after 2 years of legal battles and investigations, the NIH reinstated Fishbein. In 1981, at the NIAID, Fauci's organization, employees were investigated for moonlighting in the private sector, and Fauci's ethical violations did not stay inside of just America's borders. In 2002, the FDA threatened to send inspectors to investigate ethical violations in the NIAID's AIDS study conducted in Uganda. The study concluded that Fauci's organization was in serious non-compliance with FDA regulations, including failing to disclose serious risks to the study's participants. In order to stave off a formal FDA investigation, the NIAID hired a consulting group, Westat. But what their own consulting group uncovered was even worse. It seemed many of the records were, quote, lost, including a ledger that logged the injuries and deaths of the participants. The unexplained deaths of the foster children in Dr. Fauci's AIDS drug trial and the missing records for his Uganda AIDS program raised doubts about his ethics and leadership capabilities. But most of the scandals connected to him that have occurred revolve around one thing: money. Quote, there are going to be resources that are going to have to be forthcoming to be able to implement the kind of things that I think are going to be needed, he said. In 2003, he redirected $117 million away from infectious disease research towards developing a new anthrax vaccine. The very next year, he directed $5.6 billion, that's billion with a B, to bioterrorism research. The project was so unsuccessful, despite the billions of dollars spent on it, that 4 years later, the government pulled the plug. Again, Fauci failed to develop the vaccine he had promised and accepted payment for. Fauci admitted that, quote, at the end of the day, you're not going to kill as many people with an anthrax attack as you would if you blasted off a couple of car bombs in Times Square. In other words, the program had been a waste of time and money. After Fauci's failure to develop a vaccine to fight AIDS, and after his failure to develop a new vaccine to fight anthrax, he spent the next decade on his new hobby horse, a wild goose chase looking for a pandemic. In 2005, he warned the world of an imminent and devastating bird flu pandemic. Quote, there's still the potential for a very serious public health catastrophe, he warned. How can you respond to the worst case scenario? He wrote in a paper, quote, most public experts agree that it is only a matter of time before another catastrophic influenza epidemic occurs, and it certainly will occur in the 21st century. This imminent threat obviously required more funding, and the next year, the dreaded bird flu arrived. But it wasn't as dire as he had predicted. By May of 2006, the World Health Organization estimated that the bird flu had killed 100 people worldwide. This was good news for the world, but bad news for Fauci. By 2009, he had high hopes for a new impending pandemic, swine flu. This disease can be very dangerous, especially to young people. Sensational headlines about hundreds of college students coming down with it at the same time in a single university created concern. But in October, CBS investigative journalist Cheryl Atkinson told the world, quote, if you've been diagnosed with probable or presumed 2009 H1N1 or swine flu in recent months, you may be surprised to know this. The odds are you didn't have H1N1 flu. In fact, you probably didn't have flu at all. It seems that despite reports of the flu raging all around in late July of 2009, public health officials stopped counting individual cases. CBS filed a Freedom of Information request to figure out why the public health bureaucracy had shut down testing during a crisis. Quote, they wouldn't answer a Freedom of Information request that we filed. They wouldn't answer questions we posed to them. We approached Dr. Frieden, who heads the CDC, at an unrelated news conference to confront him about this lack of information. The tape of that confrontation plays, quote, what can we do to get that information released to us? Your office has stopped communicating with us. Response, I am aware of the issue. Once we're comfortable in that, we will be happy to release it to you. I do not know whether that will be today or not. While waiting for those numbers, Atkinson contacted all 50 states asking for each state's lab-confirmed swine flu tests. An overwhelming majority of the cases, air quotes, were negative for swine flu. Quote, with most cases diagnosed solely on symptoms and risk factors, the H1N1 flu epidemic may seem worse than it is, Atkinson concluded. A German politician and physician went so far as to accuse public health officials and drug companies of exaggerating the risk of the pandemic in order to sell, wait for it, vaccines, calling it one of the greatest medical scandals of the century. Fauci had come much closer this time to getting his big pandemic, but it was still a swing and a miss. 7 years later, in 2016, he finally found another new pandemic to worry about, an outbreak of Zika virus in Brazil. Zika can cause devastating birth defects for babies of infected pregnant women. While he waited for approval for his hundreds of millions of dollars to research Zika, he announced that he would unilaterally divert funds from researching malaria, influenza, and tuberculosis in order to develop a Zika vaccine. But the Zika threat, thankfully, also never materialized in the United States. Surely the measure of the success of any public health official is the public's health. Did people get healthier or sicker on his watch? For Anthony Fauci, even pre-COVID, the public's health problems, which were his problems to fix, have only gotten worse under his leadership. He has relied on fear-mongering, been responsible for financial mismanagements. He has produced false predictions while failing to produce the vaccines he diverted funds to, and failing to improve the health of public officials while making public statements and speculations that only increased panic surrounding health crises. Even if this is incompetence rather than anything malicious, why have there been no consequences for said extreme incompetence? For 2 years, under both President Trump and President Biden, Anthony Fauci virtually ruled the world. His policies led to bankruptcies, economic stagnation, and crippling isolation, under which conditions some poor souls died. Education and childhood development is another area where we will see ripple effects of these policies for years to come, perhaps for generations. We've seen rises in depression and anxiety, suicides, and homeless encampments as we obediently followed the science. And out of Fauci's own mouth, we were told that the science is him. In the beginning, Dr. Fauci told USA Today that the threat of COVID was, quote, minuscule. He openly mocked people's fears. Quote, at the same time people are worrying about going to Chinese restaurants, the threat is a pretty bad influenza season, particularly dangerous for our children. Adding, quote, be more concerned about influenza, which is going into a second peak for this season, than coronavirus. Fauci showed a special scorn for the trend among the frightened public of wearing face masks. Quote, people wearing masks now is just not relevant. You don't need to be walking around with a mask right now. Masks, quite frankly, are more important for people who are infected to prevent them from infecting someone else. If you look at the masks that you buy in a drugstore, the leakage around that doesn't really do much to protect you. People start saying, should I start wearing a mask? Now, in the United States, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to wear a mask. On March 8th, he went on 60 Minutes to discourage the use of masks. Quote, "There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. Wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not going to provide the perfect coverage that people think that it is." Because people trusted Fauci, they began parroting his lines. Democratic Senator Derek Swalwell tweeted out on March 4th, 2020, "Stop wearing face masks." And the Surgeon General followed suit. "Seriously, people, stop buying masks," all in caps. "They are not effective at preventing general public from catching coronavirus. But if healthcare providers can't get them to care for sick patients, it puts them and our communities at risk." Going on Face the Nation to tell us, masks do not work for the general public in preventing them from getting coronavirus. End quote. But as he had during the AIDS epidemic, 1 month later, Fauci reversed his position. Quote, "There should be universal wearing of masks. There should be the extent possible social distancing, avoiding crowds, outdoors always better than indoors." And by April 3rd, the same Surgeon General was telling the public to wear, quote, "cloth face coverings in public settings where other social distancing measures are difficult to maintain." But the data that was cited as the reason for the reversal of positions had not actually changed much over those weeks, and has recently proven virtually non-existent according to congressional hearings. Remember Morgan Freeman's Mask Up America commercials? Quote, "Because your mask doesn't protect you, it protects me, and I wear my mask to protect you." 2 years later, CNN analyst Leanna Wen admitted on air that cloth masks are, quote, "little more than facial decorations. There's no place for them in light of Omicron." Perhaps the most disturbing part of Fauci's public but typical flip-flopping was that he said, quote, "The critical issue was to save the masks for the people who really needed them because it was felt that there was a shortage of masks." So in other words, you weren't wrong. You believed all along that masks were effective at preventing the outbreak. But you lied to the public, knowing that said lies would result in many, many people dying because you wanted to save the masks for the health professionals. And rather than be honest about that, when the much-feared shortage didn't materialize, you flip-flopped and finally told the public the truth to wear masks? Do I have that right? Fauci has a consistent record of believing that his desired political ends always justify his dishonest means. His own words says that it was his political views on priorities that were dictating his policies as far as his early masking recommendations went, rather than the scientific data. There wasn't any change in the data between his first stance and the one he took only a few weeks later. The only thing that changed during that time was the political situation. And it has been politics that have dictated many of his scientific decisions over the years. This fact only seems to irritate Fauci when he was called on it. For goodness sake, I've never had any political ideologies that I've made public. I'm really just talking to you about public health. When I'm telling you, wear a mask, keep social distancing, avoid crowds, there's nothing political about that. That's a public health message that we know works. Many people's answering question is, how can there be nothing political about any public policy, especially one that affects millions of people around the world? Dr. Fauci works for the government. His job is to craft public policies for political decisions regarding health for that government. It is a political job as much as a scientific one, and he has done nothing but fail at both. He says he pushes the policies that work, but work at accomplishing what? A clock works for the purpose of telling time, and even a stopped clock is right twice a day. A telephone works at making phone calls. It doesn't work at washing laundry. Public policies work when they achieve their goals. So if Fauci's policies worked, according to him, the natural question is, worked at accomplishing what? What were his goals? The Constitution declares that we, the people, determine what those goals are, and therefore we determine how successful public policies have been at achieving our goals. But what were Fauci's goals? He seems to be of the mistaken impression, in his mindset, that the bureaucrats and experts set the goals, and the people merely exist to follow their dictates in order to achieve the goals laid out for them, not by them. One of the problems with an oligarchy controlled by experts is that the experts are often, historically speaking, wrong. And Fauci wasn't done flip-flopping on masks. When asked if double masking increases your protection on January of 2021, Fauci responded, it likely does. Because this is a physical covering to prevent droplets and viruses to get in. So if you have a physical covering with one layer, you put another layer on it. It just makes common sense that it likely would be more effective. Then when some people began criticizing him for citing common sense rather than providing scientific evidence for his claims, he did another interview a week later reversing his position. Quote, there are many people who feel, if you really want to have an extra little bit of protection, maybe I should put 2 masks on. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's no data that indicates that that is going to make a difference. Then Fauci moved on from mask flip-flopping to implying that he had prophetic abilities by claiming that he had always said that a respiratory illness like COVID-19 would be his worst nightmare. But if this is true, then why did he start out the pandemic describing the risk as, I have just received the headline that Trump has been shot. Apparently he was holding a rally in Pennsylvania, and a shooter from a nearby building shot through the crowd and bleachers, and apparently Trump has been hit. Also, another rally goer was killed. Another person was injured. I don't know how serious Trump's injuries are, but his face is apparently splattered with blood, and apparently the Secret Service immediately went into action and, quote, blew the guy's head off. I am going to pause in the recording of my podcast to try to get some of the details to pass on real quick. But obviously this is not a good thing. I've been very clear about my position on Trump. I'm not a fan, but this is not something that should be solved by violence, and the media should be ashamed of themselves because they have been promoting the conditions for this for a long time now with their inflammatory accusations that he's Hitler, that he's evil, that he's the end of democracy, all this sort of stuff. And that this is where that sort of rhetoric leads to. It leads to someone taking you literally, and if they really are under threat of being under Hitler and democracy ending for all time, then it becomes rational to take a shot at someone. So the media should be very, very ashamed of themselves right now. I know I'm ashamed of them. And I don't have to be a Trump fan, I am not one, to feel that way. Okay, after a couple of minutes of research, I can report that Trump has just now posted on Truth Social that he wanted to thank the Secret Service for their job. He confirmed that the shooter is dead. He extended his condolences to the family of the victim in the crowd that is also dead, and his condolences to the victim who was severely injured in the crowd. He apparently, according to him, was shot through the ear, and that was what the blood on his face was from. So literally, we almost had a fatal assassination, a couple of centimeters to the left, and we would be reliving Kennedy right now. So, once again, the media is responsible for this. I don't like Trump. I'm not a fan, but he doesn't deserve to be murdered. There's plenty of things I don't like about him and plenty of criticisms that are valid, but he does not deserve to have the media stoking crazy people all the time by telling them that the world is coming to an end, that democracy is coming to an end, that we are literally going to be living under Hitler, when we lived under this man for 4 years. And I didn't like a lot of his tweets, I didn't like a lot of the things he did, but it wasn't like living under Hitler. Using that kind of rhetoric only inflames crazy people. It's irresponsible, and the media carries a huge blame for what was almost an assassination here. And that is not forgivable. I'm sure there will be no consequences, but there really need to be. And to be clear, so that I am not guilty of doing the same thing, I don't mean consequences in the form of violence. I pray to God there is no further violence on this issue. But I do mean that people need to be posting, tweeting, demanding, turning off their TVs, refusing to listen to, refusing to watch, all these sort of things. People on both sides of the aisle that use this kind of inflammatory rhetoric that is just asking for a crazy person to take it the wrong way and do something like this. We do not want to see people murdered. I've said I'm not a fan of Biden's. I don't want to see Biden murdered. There are lots of people out there that I'm not fans of. I don't want to see someone take a shot at any of them, and that includes Trump. And that should be the position of all reasonable people. Whether you like them, hate them, whatever, you should not want to see someone take a shot at them. It is truly awful that things have come to this in the United States. I recently watched a video of Ronald Reagan's presidential debate where he was running for re-election, and the moderator asked him about his advanced age at the time. I mean, compared to Joe Biden, it's nothing, but at the time, it was pretty old for a president to be running again. And the moderator asked him about, was he capable of handling the pressures of the job at his advanced age? And with his very charming grin and a twinkle in his eye, he laughingly said that he was not going to make age an issue in this election, that he was not going to exploit his opponent's youth and inexperience in this election. Both the moderator and his opponent laughed. Everybody was capable of disagreeing with each other and still not calling each other the devil, joking, laughing at each other, and moving forward as a country. That wasn't 100 years ago, people. That was 40 years ago. We need to return to that. We need to return to a place where we can disagree and do so civilly and do so with humor and understanding for the other person's position without all this inflammatory rhetoric and dangerous stands that are getting people shot. It's ridiculous, it's unnecessary, and it is unforgivable. It really is. No matter which side of the aisle you're on, or your opinions about Trump. As I said, I'm not a fan, but I do not want to see shots fired at anyone. And that includes him. He's a human being. He may not be the most moral of human beings. He may not be the most admirable of human beings, but he is a human being, and he doesn't deserve to have his head blown off. So let's please return to some sanity here when it comes to politics. I'm going to try to get a few more headlines just to confirm that everything seems to be status quo, if you can call a situation where this happens status quo, and then I will return to my scheduled recording of my podcast. So I've seen the footage of the shooting, and it appeared that Trump was in the middle of giving a speech. You clearly heard 3 or 4 shots ring out. Some of that may have been the Secret Service firing back, and then clearly after that, there were shots fired by the Secret Service. And you saw Trump grab his ear and then duck down. The people behind him duck down. The crowd began to scream, and they weren't sure who was hit, who was alive. So you heard a lot of screaming as the Secret Service piled on top of Trump and stayed there for a few seconds. Then you heard them coordinating with each other to get up, keeping him kind of in the center of a huddle, at which point they finally did get up. You could see he was hit, but appeared to be all right. There was blood on the side of his face from where he was hit in the ear, and you could hear him call out to the Secret Service, "Wait, wait, wait," as he tried to gesture to the crowd that he was all right, raising his fist in the air. And then the Secret Service hurried him off. Apparently, one of the people behind him was hit and killed. Their face was covered up as quickly as possible. And apparently 2 other people are seriously hit and wounded. Trump tweeted out, as I said, that what had happened from his point of view from the hospital, and just a few seconds ago his motorcade left the hospital. So we know that one family is definitely in mourning tonight, the loss of their loved one. Hopefully the families of the other 2 victims will not be in that same situation. I don't know how seriously they're hit. And obviously Trump's children are beginning to react to the fearful, incident from their perspective that their father was almost killed. So for their sake, I'm certainly glad that they are not in that position. As somebody who's lost parents, I would never wish that on anyone else. So I am going to probably leave these comments in the podcast, even though by Monday this will all be old news, but this was happening in real time, so I will probably wind up leaving it in, and we'll resume my normal podcast. Okay, where were we? Back up a couple of sentences here. Then Fauci moved on from mask flip-flopping to imply that he had prophetic abilities by claiming that he had always said that a respiratory illness like COVID-19 would be his worst nightmare. But if this is true, then why did he start out the pandemic describing the risk as being minuscule? Quote, "The risk right now is really relatively low," he told us. Well, even the best scientists are allowed a few mistakes, right? Okay. What about lockdowns? On January 4th, 2020, Fauci was asked if the U.S. would consider lockdown policies to stop the spread of the virus. He emphatically answered no. It was unthinkable. Quote, "I don't think we possibly could do in the United States. I can't imagine shutting down New York or Los Angeles. And they would serve no medical purpose," he said. Quote, "Historically, when you shut things down, it doesn't necessarily have a major effect." When asked about lockdowns during the 2014 Ebola scare, Fauci said the same. Quote, "We have to be careful that there are unintended consequences. There are other ways to protect. There's monitoring, there's direct monitoring, there's active monitoring. We don't necessarily need to do that." As usual, Fauci flip-flopped. By March of 2020, only 2 months after vehemently opposing the idea of lockdowns, Fauci was singing a new song. Quote, "If you look at the curve of outbreaks, they go big peaks and they come down. What we need to do is flatten that down. The next thing you know, everyone is repeating the phrase, flatten the curve." Neil Ferguson, an epidemiologist at the Imperial College in London, had put together a doomsday prediction of COVID deaths, which Fauci wholeheartedly embraced. The model predicted the imminent death of over 2 million Americans to the coronavirus. We've already discussed the serious gaps in even the best of these models when it comes to predicting the future, when it comes to climate change. But these gaps apply to predictions made by these models on any subject. 43 out of the 50 states issued shelter-in-place lockdown orders, and the biggest problem with Fauci's use of this model was that it was completely bogus. According to a reporter at the Daily Telegraph, a couple of months later, the model was a, quote, buggy mess that looked more like a bowl of angel hair pasta than a finely tuned piece of programming. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh attempted to duplicate Ferguson's findings, and not only did they get different results on each machine they used, but they didn't even get the same results when they used the same machine and ran the test twice. And, quote, the results were quite different, according to the researchers. Oxford professor Michael Bonsall said of Ferguson's negligence, and by extension Fauci's, quote, models must be capable of passing the basic scientific test of producing the same results given the same initial set of parameters. Otherwise, there is simply no way of knowing whether they will be reliable. So a foreign scientist's use of a single test from a glitchy model was Fauci's big, hard science for sending the entire United States into lockdown? And he did this despite a substantial body of literature written by other epidemiologists that strongly condemned lockdowns. Under lockdowns, mental health crises skyrocketed, as did suicides. People were unable to be with their loved ones during their final moments or even attend their funerals and receive the support of friends and family during this difficult time. Children were kept out of school for years, though the information even early on indicated that children were not at any significant risk from COVID. We are still dealing with both the antisocial ramifications and the plummeting standards caused by students being so far behind that 1/3 of 8th graders are, for all practical purposes, completely illiterate. A 12-year-old boy, Hayden, hung himself in his room over the lockdowns only days before his 13th birthday. He suffered from increased anxiety over the lockdowns. He wanted to play football. He wanted to see his friends. He hated the online remote learning. Lockdowns cost him his young life. Fauci's record of incompetence during both the AIDS epidemic and COVID would have more than justified ousting him from his position of power. Instead, we heard very little about any of this. Even if his policies had merely failed to help, his ousting would have been justified. But the reality is that his policies didn't just fail to help. They made things worse. In 2022, a meta-analysis of 34 qualified studies out of the premier Johns Hopkins University concluded that the lockdowns had little to no effects on COVID mortality, while imposing enormous economic and social costs and, quote, contributed to reducing economic activity, raising unemployment, reducing schooling, causing political unrest, contributing to domestic violence, and undermining liberal democracy. Jonas Herby said, quote, we look at all the evidence and we find that the average lockdown in Europe and the United States only reduced mortality by 0.2%. And as tragic as the COVID casualties were, the difference between the predictions and what actually happened was vast. A U.S. Navy hospital ship was sent to relieve overcrowded hospitals in New York, but set sail 1 month later, having assisted only 182 patients. And an emergency hospital set up in Manhattan's Jarvis Center remained mostly empty. Yet, despite the science not only not supporting these measures, but often downright contradicting them, these draconian policies stayed in place for years for some people. During this time, Fauci went from opposing the lockdowns as ill-advised and impractical to 15 days to stop the spread and flatten the curve. This turned into months and even years as stopping the spread became finding a cure. And after the surge, when the vaccine proved much less effective than promised, things continued to just drag on in lockdown. Quote, I believe we'll start to see much more being open about indoor situations, be they theaters, be they restaurants, be they schools, be they workplaces. That doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly the way it was 3 or 4 years ago, Fauci said. While the World Health Organization cautioned, quote, it's not vaccines instead of masks. It's not vaccines instead of distancing. Do it all. The time period of searching for a vaccine is one of the most telling about Fauci's ethics and competence. As per usual, he got it wrong every step of the way. In March of 2020, he said that developing a COVID vaccine is, quote, going to take a year and a half at least. Pfizer created a vaccine 4 months later. They signed a contract with the government for 1 million doses later that month and submitted the vaccine to the FDA for emergency authorization just 4 more months after that. The entire process took less than 9 months, not at least 18. And that's all before the controversies, the misinformation, and herd immunity issues that emerged after that. For most of 2020, Dr. Fauci claimed that 60 to 70% would need to become immune to COVID-19 either through coming out the other side of infection or by being vaccinated in order to reach herd immunity. By November, he had shifted those numbers to 70 to 75%. Only 1 month later, Fauci again inflated the numbers and moved the goalpost to 75, 80, and 85%. When called out on the inconsistencies, Fauci finally admitted that he had no idea what percentages were necessary to actually reach herd immunity. Eventually, a CNN anchor finally asked him, quote, "Why weren't you straight with the American people about this to begin with?" He bristled, quote, "No, actually, Dana, I don't think it can be interpreted as being straight or not. We have to realize that we have to be humble and realize what we don't know." So why didn't he do that to begin with? And what's with the plural pronouns? When bragging, he didn't say, "We are the science." He said, "I am the science." But when he's wrong, it's not, "I am wrong." It's, "We are wrong." Not, "I need to be humble and admit what I don't know," but we need to be humble and admit what we don't know. He does realize that this is no longer Britain, right? We don't have a monarchy, and he isn't the queen. He doesn't get to refer to himself in the plural. The truth is that he simply hoped to manipulate more and more people into taking the vaccine by slowly inching the numbers higher and higher. That's not my opinion of what he did. He admitted as much on TV. Quote, "When polls said only about half of all Americans would take a vaccine, I was saying herd immunity would take about 70 to 75%. Then when new surveys showed that 60% or more would take it, I thought, I can nudge this up a bit. So I went to 80, 85. So basically, you thought you had the right to manipulate us for our own good. Do I have that right?" Once again, he took an unscientific and worse, unethical approach to achieve his political goals. Worst of all, he initially promised that vaccinated people would neither contract nor spread COVID-19. Both promises proved completely false. The CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, joined him in these false promises. This caused neighbor to turn on neighbor over the personal choice of being vaccinated. This never made sense to me, because if you believed that you were safe once you were vaccinated, why did you need to force your neighbor to become vaccinated too? Wasn't he only risking his own health? Yet every anchor on both sides of the ocean didn't see it that way and condemned the unvaccinated for putting all of society at risk. I'm obviously not obligated to share my story, but I will. I was caught between a rock and a hard place. I believe in vaccines. I have all the old school vaccines that were recommended when I was a child, and I would do it again. I do not take the flu shot or the pneumonia vaccine, despite yearly pressure, as I have had several strange and life-threatening allergic reactions to medications that have only gotten worse over time. I have also become very efficient at managing my risks, and have never contracted pneumonia or the flu, unlike most vaccinated people I know who get the flu yearly, usually right after their shot, but I digress. My health conditions leave me severely immune compromised, so COVID was truly a life-threatening possibility for me. But with my history of reactions, so was the vaccine, especially a new and undocumented vaccine. Through my usual extreme care and lack of contact, and some sheer luck, I had managed to avoid contracting COVID for years. This probably saved my life. I had specialists on both sides of the issue, some urging me to get the vaccine, some, knowing my history, urging me not to. I ultimately had to use my experience from years of handling my complicated health issues and go with my gut. I made a controversial and very personal choice. I did not get vaccinated for COVID. It has proven to be the right choice for me. I have no advice for anyone else. I finally contracted COVID for the first time 11 months ago. Though it was a miserable experience, it was thankfully a mild case with none of the anticipated complications I feared and one would expect in someone in my state of poor health. So far, that is the only time I have contracted COVID. I do not feel as though I should be looked down on for making a difficult, tailored choice based on my pretty thorough knowledge of my individual health and the risks of my individual living situation. And if I had chosen to be vaccinated, I don't feel that I would deserve condemnation for that either. I do not like all the intense pressure and adamant tribalization being used to not only make your own decision, but to force other people to make the same decision you did, whichever of the two decisions that might have been. It is not right, and it needs to stop. Those who want to be vaccinated should be able to do so without condemnation. Those who do not want to be vaccinated should be able to do so without condemnation. I dislike Piers Morgan, but as far as I know, he is the only one who admitted that he was wrong for pressuring others via guilt before it became evident that even the vaccinated could spread COVID to others. So I'll at least give him credit for that. Quote, "The vaccines are highly effective," promised Fauci. Quote, "You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccines," promised Biden. Quote, "Vaccinated people do not carry the virus and don't get sick," the media told us. Quote, "Everyone who takes the vaccine is not just protecting themselves, but reducing their transmission," celebrities lectured. When confirmed cases of vaccinated people who had contracted COVID post-vaccine began being reported, Fauci and others dismissed them as breakthrough cases. But eventually there were so many of these breakthrough cases that they were forced to admit that the vaccine did not stop either infection or transmission. And like the flu vaccine, you were supposed to be satisfied with the unverifiable claim that the case you had contracted would have been worse had you not been vaccinated in the first place. Even the vaccinated were required to continue masking because, quote, "If a vaccinated person gets COVID, uncommon," a tweet from a health expert read, quote, "they harbor the same amount of virus in their noses as unvaccinated." Supposedly, the vaccines worked very well at lessening severity, but all pretense at preventing transmission was soon dropped. Fauci's story about the origins of the virus began to fall apart too. In May of 2020, he made claims to National Geographic that the virus, quote, "could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated." Since then, it has been proven that he used backdoor channels to fund banned gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute. Gain-of-function research is where scientists deliberately modify a virus to make it stronger, more resistant, more deadly, or more transmissible than it naturally is. They do this so that they can then try to create a cure for a disease that would not otherwise exist. The dangers of such research is obvious, and that's why it was banned, and needs to be banned again. Even China could be stopped from pursuing this type of science if the world joined together, and sanctioned the bleep out of them. If they were not allowed to travel to any other country that did not want to fall under the same travel ban, or trade with any other country, if they were forced to choose between living in complete isolation in order to pursue gain-of-function research, or if they denied access to inspectors in order to ensure that they were being truthful about not doing that kind of research, and they were forced to choose between that or functioning as a part of the world, then they would be forced to abandon it. And if they did not, any new virus they created could at least be contained to their country. New gain-of-function research is taking place with other viruses as we speak. It needs to be banned, no matter how much fun scientists have playing with their chemistry sets. We have to live in this world too. The discussions about disrespecting your neighbor's right to health isn't one we should be having over vaccines, it's one we should be having over research. Doctors who publicly stated that from the beginning they saw markers within the virus that indicated that it could not be natural, that it had been artificially manipulated, were silenced and even took back their statements with very sketchy stories about being at Mardi Gras and not knowing what they were typing. Fauci testified before Congress, where he was exposed for lying about funding China's banned gain-of-function research. As rumors and conspiracy theories spread by October, Fauci doubled down on his denials, saying that it was even molecularly impossible for COVID-19 to have leaked from a laboratory. Quote, "The viruses that we discussed, including the viruses that Senator Paul has mentioned, would be molecularly impossible to have resulted in SARS-CoV-2, he testified before Congress. Then a pile of his emails revealed that all the way back in January of 2020, a virologist from the esteemed Scripps Research Institute emailed Fauci to let him know that some of the virus's features, quote, looked engineered, and that the genome is inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. I know the Scripps medical community. Some of my most difficult surgeries were done at Scripps Hospital in La Jolla. If that's what they say, I believe them. With evidence of a lab leak mounting, if not entirely conclusive, in May of 2021, Fauci did what Fauci does best. He flip-flopped. Katie Sanders of PolitiFact asked him if he was confident that the virus developed naturally. He responded, quote, "No, I'm not convinced about that." And that month, he refused to rule out the possibility of a lab origin when testifying before the Senate. Senator Rand Paul asked him, quote, "Will you, in front of this group, categorically say that the COVID-19 could not have occurred through passage in a laboratory?" Fauci answered, quote, "I do not have any accounting of what the Chinese may have done, and I'm fully in favor of any further investigation of what went on in China. However, I will repeat again, the NIH and NIAID categorically has not funded gain-of-function research to be conducted in the Wuhan Institute of Virology." This was a lie. Fauci's agency had indeed funded gain-of-function research and at the Wuhan Institute. The grant approval documents prove it. But before we get to that, equally important is Fauci's ever-shifting, self-serving positions. First, it was molecularly impossible on a scientific level for the virus to have originated outside of nature. Then, he wasn't convinced that it couldn't have originated in a lab. Then, he had no idea what the Chinese might have done, but he knew that he had not in any way funded whatever they did and favored further investigations. Then a couple of weeks later, he flip-flopped again. He told CBS News that he remained confident that it was, quote, highly likely that the virus occurred naturally, spreading from animal to human. At that same time, people were being banned from social media for saying that they personally believed that it was possible that the virus originated in a lab. Now Fauci himself had said as much before Congress and taken it back. Is this level of incompetence at best and malice at worst acceptable in the federal government's highest paid employee? He seems to have based his career on taking every side of every question publicly so that he can never be proven completely wrong, though in reality, that makes him always wrong. The political establishment continues to back him. Jen Psaki said, quote, "The major platforms have a responsibility related to the health and safety of all Americans to stop amplifying untrustworthy content." While Fauci himself argued that, quote, "People who feel differently, who have conspiracy theories, who deny reality that's looking them straight in the eye, those are people that don't particularly care for me. And sometimes the truth becomes inconvenient for some people, and so they react against me." It was all about him. No one could have legitimate concerns that he was fallible like any other human being. No, they must only be questioning his story on the illegitimate basis of a personal dislike for him. That was the only possibility. And they must be silenced for it. I remember watching a video posted by him where he was personally going door to door in poor black neighborhoods to encourage the residents to get vaccinated. He told a wary mother on her porch that she would not be able to pass the virus on to her young children if she had the vaccine. This was well after the information had come out that the vaccine did not stop transmission. He also told her in his own video that there was no chance that she could get COVID after being vaccinated. And if she did, which was already a contradiction, it would be such a mild case that she wouldn't even have any symptoms. Having personally known several people who got COVID after being vaccinated, who had very noticeable symptoms, combined with the fact that it was common knowledge by this point that you could spread the virus to others whether you were vaccinated or not, and unaware of the controversy since I had not participated in social media until shortly before that, I posted a short comment on YouTube. It was an honest, polite comment, asking how it was possible for him to be allowed to tell this poor mother things that were known to be scientifically untrue by now. That was it. A question. A factually based question, not even couched in inflammatory terms. That was the first time I was banned from YouTube. It was an interesting experience. Up until that point, I thought people had been exaggerating about being censored, that surely they had said something truly egregious to warrant such action. On May 12th, 2021, over a year into the COVID pandemic that had shut down the world, Senator Rand Paul accused Dr. Fauci of funding the same type of research that was thought to have caused the pandemic, at the very same institute where the virus is thought to have originated and escaped. Once again, gain-of-function research takes a natural virus and artificially enhances one of its properties, making it more potent, more deadly, or more transmissible. If that sounds dangerous, it's because it is. That's why the U.S. government placed a moratorium on that kind of research in 2014. It was lifted 2 years before the COVID-19 pandemic. Quote, "Dr. Fauci, do you still support funding of the lab in..." Fauci interrupted. Quote, "Senator Paul, with all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect. The NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research." Undeterred, Senator Paul continued, "Government scientists like yourself who favor gain-of-function research maintain..." Fauci again interrupted. I don't favor gain of function in China. You are saying things that are not correct. But his denial turned out to be a lie. Through a Freedom of Information request, The Interceptor obtained documents that show that the NIH did, in fact, support the dangerous research. Not only did it support gain-of-function research, but it supported gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute. On May 27th, 2014, Dr. Fauci gave a grant of, I kid you not, $666,000 to them for the study of bat coronaviruses, which included funding gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The grant was for a project that would run from 2014 through 2019, and the gain-of-function moratorium was still in place from 2014 until 2017. Richard Ebright, a professor of chemistry and chemical biology at Rutgers University, said, quote, "The documents make it clear that assertions by the NIH director, Francis Collins, and the NIAID director, Anthony Fauci, that the NIH did not support gain-of-function research or potential pandemic pathogen enhancement in Wuhan are untruthful." In serious trouble for funding banned research while it was still banned and lying about it, the NIH attempted to redefine what gain-of-function research is to save itself. They tried to argue that only research conducted with the explicit intent to make organisms more virulent falls within that category. Fauci denied before Congress that Ralph Barrick, a leading gain-of-function researcher, actually engaged in gain-of-function research. Yeah, and a painter never actually painted anything. A trained chef specializing in the culinary arts never actually cooked anything. Sure. Then, in the next breath, he argued that the gain-of-function research that Dr. Barrick had engaged in was perfectly fine, as it took place in North Carolina, not Wuhan, China. The reality was that Dr. Barrick had partnered closely with Dr. Shi Zhengli, the director for the Center of Emerging Infectious Diseases at the Wuhan Institute. They even published a paper together about their research entitled "A SARS-like Cluster Circulating Bat Coronaviruses Shows Potential for Human Emergence." In the paper, Dr. Barrick even admitted, quote, "The potential to prepare for and mitigate future outbreaks must be weighed against the risk of creating more dangerous pathogens." Fauci clearly understood the risks, too, as he said, quote, "We had a big scare with SARS-CoV-1 back in 2002-2003. That particular virus unquestionably went from a bat to an intermediate host to start an epidemic and a pandemic that resulted in 8,000 cases and close to 800 deaths. But he still chose after that to gamble with the public's safety. In an article in 2012, he said, quote, "In an unlikely but conceivable turn of events, what if that scientist became infected with the virus, which leads to an outbreak and ultimately triggers a pandemic? Many ask reasonable questions. Given the possibility of such a scenario, however remote, should the initial experiments have been performed and or published in the first place? And what were the processes involved in this decision? Scientists working in this field might say, as indeed I have said, that the benefits of such experiments and the resulting knowledge outweighs the risk. It is more likely that a pandemic would occur in nature, and the need to stay ahead of such a threat is a primary reason for performing an experiment that might appear to be risky. Within the research community, many have expressed concerns that important research progress could come to a halt just because of the fear that someone somewhere might attempt to replicate these experiments sloppily. This is a valid concern. So, not only did Fauci fund this risky, banned research, despite his testimony before Congress to the contrary, But the NIH had specifically funded it at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Quote, "You got to go where the action is." So I often say, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, you don't want to study bats in Fairfax County, Virginia, to find out what the animal-human interface is that might lead to a jumping of species. So we had a modest collaboration with very respectable Chinese scientists who are world experts on coronavirus. For our players keeping score at home, first he denied that he did this kind of research. Ever. And he even denied supporting this kind of research. Then it came out that he actually had. Then he claimed that he didn't specifically fund the Wuhan Institute. Then it came out that, again, he had. Then he admitted that he had sent funds to the Wuhan Institute, but that they hadn't been used for gain-of-function research. For the win, who wants to guess what happened next? On October 20th, 2021, the NIH admitted that it had funded gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute, where the pandemic is believed to have originated. The NIH even blamed its previous denials on EcoHealth Alliances, the nonprofit it had used to fund the Wuhan Institute. According to the NIH, an organization with a record of lying, quote, EcoHealth President Peter Daszak had failed to report the gain of function, but the public health authorities were confident that this research on bat coronaviruses could not in any way have led to the pandemic, end quote. Well, I feel better. I'm glad that they're confident that they found that their illegal dealings, which they covered up and they lied about, they don't think that they caused the pandemic. That makes one of us who feels confident about that. In 2018, Peter Daszak of EcoHealth applied to the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, for a $14 million grant to partner with the Wuhan Institute and construct SARS-related bat coronaviruses into which they could insert human-specific cleavage sites to evaluate growth potential of the pathogens. DARPA rejected the proposal because it considered the gain-of-function research to be too dangerous. You think? Too risky for DARPA, too risky for us, too risky for the victims of the pandemic, but not too risky for Anthony Fauci. Vanity Fair reported in October of 2021, quote, one distinctive segment of SARS-CoV-2's genetic code is a furin cleavage site. It makes the virus more infectious by allowing it to efficiently enter human cells. Jamie Metzel, a former executive vice president of the Asia Society and a member of the World Health Organization Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, found this coincidence to be just a little too strange. Yeah, you and me both, buddy. He said, quote, if I applied for funding to paint Central Park purple and was denied, but then a year later, we woke up to find Central Park painted purple, I'd be a prime suspect. We owe the uncovering of that grant proposal to a group of independent journalists who call themselves Drastic, the decentralized, radical, autonomous search team investigating COVID-19. Gilles Dumanoff, a data scientist from New Zealand and member of Drastic, summed up what so many are thinking who have followed Dr. Fauci's career closely. Quote, I cannot be sure that the pandemic originated from a research-related accident or infection from a sampling trip. But I am 100% sure that there was a massive cover-up. The question is, why? And of what? I was horrified when President Biden tried to use OSHA, of all organizations, which is not even a health organization, as a backdoor method of enforcing a vaccine mandate on millions of unwilling workers. If not for the Daily Wire suing the government and the courts finding that the mandate was outside of OSHA's jurisdiction, no kidding, and unconstitutional, we would be living in a very different world right now. And people like me, at high risk for taking the vaccine, would be forced to take that risk against our will in order to be employed anywhere. That is an abuse of power by the Biden administration that I will not forget. For 40 years, serving under 7 different presidents, Anthony Fauci has amassed $10.4 million, while sidestepping all his critics, however expert they too may be. Despite failing to produce anything of value during the AIDS epidemic, failing to produce a new anthrax vaccine, and failing us all during the COVID epidemic, plus all the failures during the minor, but at the time worrisome epidemics in between, doing nothing except flip-flopping, is he really the person we want at the helm for the next and potentially much more serious pandemic? Do we want a politician in love with the cameras, or do we want a scientist who prefers his microscope? The best scientists stay in the labs, the best politicians go into government, and the craftiest politicians rule from behind the scenes. I know my answer, and as always, it will be the people who decide. So I guess we'll find out if speaking out against Anthony Fauci is still considered blasphemy online. We'll see how long this podcast remains up. If I'm not banned, I'll see you next week.